Welcome everyone, and thanks for taking me up on the offer of sharing. I do appreciate that. Always makes these sessions more enjoyable when there's a bit of interaction. So let's kick things off. So welcome to today's session on 5 ways to improve your SwaggerHub usage. So if you're here, chances are, I hope you are using SwaggerHub or your team are using SwaggerHub in some way, shape, or form for your API design and documentation. And as the title suggests, today we're going to talk about some ways that you can start using SwaggerHub today to get more out of the platform and to make sure you're getting the most out of the tool. So we'll jump in a moment. Thank you for joining. My name is Joe. I'm a solutions architect with SmartBear, and I have been for coming up on 7 years. So I've been doing this for a while, and by this I mean working with teams who are evaluating SmartBear tools. So running proofs of concept and demoing tools, demoing our API tools, helping teams figure out if our API tools are the right fit for their workflows and challenges. So there's a bit of pre-sale involved, and then post-sale, helping teams get the most out of our tools, make sure they get embedded in their workflows, make sure they get a good return on investment from the SmartBear API tools. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. This session is going to be recorded, so you will be able to watch it back or get it on demand if you can't stick around for the whole thing. Feel free to post any questions. I know up until now we've been communicating in the chat box, but if you wouldn't mind, there is a Q&A box as well. So if you have any specific technical questions or things that are kind of webinar related, please do post them in the Q&A box at any time. And then we'll have an open Q&A once we get through today's session. So a nice, concise and short and sweet agenda today. We're going to be talking about 5 ways to improve your SwaggerHub usage. We're going to do a demo. So those first two bullet points will be intermixed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a way to improve your SwaggerHub usage. Then I'll show you what that looks like within the tool. And then we'll do that for each of the 5 suggestions or tips that I have for you all today. And then we'll do a Q&A, kind of an open Q&A at the end of the session. So that's the agenda. Before I jump into the first item on the agenda, we're just going to run a quick poll. And that poll is, are you an existing SwaggerHub user? So I'm interested to hear, are you, and if anyone feels like elaborating a little bit in the chat or the Q&A box, please do. I'm interested to know, who among you are currently using SwaggerHub, or maybe you are evaluating it. Maybe you're dealing with SmartBear for like a proof of concept of SwaggerHub, or maybe you're just curious about the platform. Please do let us know in the chat if you feel like sharing. And while you're answering those questions, so we've got about 45 minutes today. So I'll move through the content as at a brisk pace. Make sure that we get through all of it. But let me know if anyone wants to stop and ask questions about something in particular. So, like I said, I have been working with SwaggerHub for quite some time, and I've seen customers succeed with it and get a lot of value out of it. But I've also seen customers, not get as much value out of it as we would like them to get. I've seen teams maybe struggle with adoption or struggle with finding the right place for SwaggerHub in their toolkit. And when I was putting together the agenda for the session, those experiences were the ones that I had in mind about, or to come up with the points here, the five tips or the 5 agenda items. So I've seen teams fail with SwaggerHub, as well as I've seen them succeed. And the idea behind the agenda today is to talk about some areas that you can look at to start getting more success out of your SwaggerHub usage, and to hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls that I've seen teams encounter sometimes. And the first point, or the first tip for getting the most out of SwaggerHub, is to get the right stakeholders involved in the API design process. So you might be happy to hear we'll be going light on slides today. So we'll really just use the slides as a kind of guideline for the different agenda points. But yeah, the first suggestion is to get the right stakeholders involved in your API design process. So any of you who are existing SwaggerHub users or have been using SwaggerHub for a while will know, or you probably will have heard from me or other members of the team or from your account manager or from SmartBear kind of material about the design first process, which is the workflow that we see SwaggerHub fitting best into. It's not the only workflow, but there's a lot of efficiencies that you can get using SwaggerHub in an API design first process. And that process is a process where when there is a new API needed on your team or in your organization, or new functionality needs to be added to an existing API, the idea is that with design first, that work happens in SwaggerHub first. And the reason for that is, maybe for anyone who happens to be on the call or on the session today who is completely new to SwaggerHub, SwaggerHub is, you can think of it like a repository for all of your open API spec definitions, your open API designs. So this is SwaggerHub. For anyone who's brand new to the tool, SwaggerHub is a place to store your API designs. So it's a design tool. It's also a documentation tool. And as of recently, it's an API exploration tool, which I'll talk about a little bit more detail later on. But as far as the design side of things goes, so I've just opened up one of my APIs here, Payee's API. I can see that it's version 1 of this API, version 1, and it's in prod. This is the versioning feature of SwaggerHub, so you can have multiple versions of an API in SwaggerHub. But where the design side of things is concerned, I want to draw our attention to the editor here. So whenever you open an API in SwaggerHub, this is your main API workspace, let's call it. And in the middle here is where you're going to do most of your design work. So this is an open API specification file, for anyone who's not familiar, an OAS file, very commonly referred to as a Swagger file. And it is a file written in YAML. You can export in JSON as well, but the editing in SwaggerHub is done with YAML. On the one hand, I'll talk about the other approach for editing in a second. But this is what I mean when I talk about getting the right, when I talk about getting the right stakeholders involved in the API design process. If I was going to create a new version of this API, I would do it right here. I would do it in SwaggerHub, create a new version. We'll call it, something like design, something along these lines, create a new version. And the idea with the design first process is that if I wanted to change the functionality of this API, add a new endpoint, add new schemas, add new functionality, that would happen in this spec file first before any implementation code is written. So the way that this relates to the first point in the agenda in terms of getting the right stakeholders involved with this process. So what I see a lot of the time is teams who maybe unintentionally restrict the usage of SwaggerHub to those who are initially involved in the evaluation. So maybe it's usually driven by, developers, engineers, anyone who's, when you think of who's an API designer, you're probably thinking of, maybe developers, right? Programmers, who's involved in the API design process. And that can be fine up to a certain point, but chances are there are other stakeholders in the business involved in, or who should ideally be involved in the API design process. And that could be, product owners, business analysts, technical writers. Increasing the APIs are not just internally facing products, but they're externally facing products. So the idea of having a tech writer involved early on to think about how the functionality is going to be presented to, someone who's not fluent in maybe your company's domain specific language. Getting those types of stakeholders involved early can help you to get more out of the collaboration features in SwaggerHub. So the collaboration features, for anyone who's, maybe brand new to the tool, or if you've been using it, maybe you're not aware of it, I can invite, if I'm the owner of this API, I can invite existing users of SwaggerHub or external users of Swagger, or who aren't in SwaggerHub yet. I can invite them to this API so that they can start collaborating on it with me, making changes to the API design, leaving comments. So comments are a very useful collaboration tool within SwaggerHub and within the editor. You can leave inline comments. Those comments can trigger notifications as well. So if a user is subscribed to notifications, they'll get a notification when a comment is left on an API that they are subscribed to. And even those two little things, right? Making active use of comments and also subscribing to notifications for APIs. Like I've worked with teams who've used SwaggerHub for a long time and they haven't touched either of those two features. And further to that, they might still only have the same set of developers working within SwaggerHub that were working on it when they first took on the tool, and they haven't thought about bringing in other roles in the team into SwaggerHub. Like I'm thinking of the um, I'm not always a big fan of the term, but in the industry that we're in, we're all familiar with the terms, technical and non-technical. We have technical people and non-technical people, right? And what I hear a lot of the time is that, or in the past, SwaggerHub wasn't very user-friendly for non-technical designers. So people that didn't necessarily want to learn the language of OpenAPI and work with YAML directly in the editor here. And up until recently, that was a little bit of a challenge for us where we didn't have a great solution for those types of users. Maybe you're a tech writer, maybe you're more of a business oriented user, but you still need to contribute to this API design because it's a product like any other application within your company. So what we do have now is the form editor, the SwaggerHub form editor, which is an editor that allows users to contribute to the API design, but instead of working with the code editor, your YAML editor, you can work with the form editor. So you can essentially just use this text editor to add models, to add paths, to add information about your API. So it's useful. It lowers the barrier to entry for those non-technical users to contribute to the API design, because there's a huge amount of value in SwaggerHub as a collaboration tool, right? And you're kind of restricting the benefits of SwaggerHub if you keep it limited to maybe a certain silo of users, especially if it's maybe for a reason that we actually have a kind of solution for within the tool, like the form editor or the likes of commenting, collaborating, things like that. Another useful thing here is that you can something users sometimes miss is that if I want to contribute to a particular API, but I'm not the owner and I haven't been invited to collaborate on it yet, I can still fork that API, make a copy of it for myself, make some changes, and then the owner of the original API can compare and merge. So you'll see those two options if you click on the name of your API in the top left of the editor view. So you've got your fork API and your compare and merge. So get the right stakeholders involved in the design process. Invite more stakeholders to the API design process. Again, if anyone does feel like sharing, I'd be interested to know, if you're an existing SwaggerHub user within your company or within your team, what are the main personas who use SwaggerHub? Are we talking developers, testers, BAs, architects? Who's actually getting hands-on with the tool day to day? I'm interested to know that because we talk about these things in the abstract sometimes with SmartBear, but I'm always very curious to hear what's actually happening, on the desks of our actual users. So with that said, I'll leave that feedback or that request for feedback there for a minute. And if anyone feels like sharing, greatly appreciate it. So thing number one that you can do right now to start getting more out of SwaggerHub is to think about who are the stakeholders for your APIs and get them involved in the API design process, because there's room for technical and non-technical users within SwaggerHub. Thing number two, which is kind of a subcategory of thing number one. Thing number two is invite your testers. So specifically, I think if I'm talking to a team that are using SwaggerHub and maybe they're using it within their SDLC, but there's no QA people, there's no testers, there's no quality assurance people or testers involved or that have been invited to SwaggerHub, or maybe they're not even aware, right? The usage of SwaggerHub is completely siloed in the software development and the dev organization. And it's just something that's used there during the dev process. But once you move outside that bubble of the org, the QA people, maybe they're not even aware that it exists, or they are not familiar with OpenAPI, or they're not familiar with Swagger. And I think they're missing a step. I think you're losing out if your leveraging OpenAPI in your development process so that your OpenAPI file is, an important technical artifact in your dev process, but you're not bringing your testers into the design phase, and you're also not using, when I say invite your testers, I would break that down into inviting your testers to the design process so that they get eyes on the OpenAPI design early, but then also using SwaggerHub as a bridge between the dev process and the test process. So what by that I mean leveraging the OpenAPI artifact to generate tests, or as a benchmark for your tests, or as something to compare test results to, right? Because ultimately, if you're using it right, the OpenAPI file should be an accurate reflection of your API's functionality once it's developed, right? It's your blueprint, and it should be accurate. It should be an accurate reflection of the actual implementation on a server somewhere of your API, whatever language it ends up getting written in. Therefore, it's going to be useful for your testers to have that as a way of saying, okay, here's what the dev team are saying this API should do, and that this is what the responses should look like, but I'm actually getting back something completely different, right? I'm the actual behavior of this API looks nothing like what's in the OpenAPI file. So the point there is that the API design artifact, the OpenAPI file in SwaggerHub, is a hugely useful thing for your testers to get their hands on and get their eyes on. And you can do that, if I jump back into SwaggerHub, you can do that in some of the ways we talked about already, like, inviting those users to collaborate on an API. Another option you have for bridging the gap between two teams and using SwaggerHub to bridge that gap are your integrations, and in particular your source control integrations, because I know every team is different, and you will always have exceptions to these things, but typically, your testers, your developers are going to be working off the same or access to the same, like, GitHub repo or source control repo as a way of sharing, the source code and artifacts, things like that. So using the source control integrations that are available in SwaggerHub can be a great way of, syncing that OpenAPI file up between two different teams. And, if you've had SwaggerHub for a few months, if you bought SwaggerHub earlier this year and you're using it in your dev process, but you haven't, set up the GitHub integration or the source control integrations, then you're losing out on value. You can set up the GitHub sync very easily here, connect to your repo, specify repo owners, sync. These are all just your options for configuring the integration. We don't have to go into those in great detail now, but my point here is that the GitHub integration could be a way to, make that OpenAPI file available to other technical teams that need to use it, like your testers, right? Your testers might be working on the same GitHub repo. They can take that file and pull it into whatever tool they're using and use it to generate tests, or use it as a way of benchmarking results, things like that. I'm going to use the SmartBear example here naturally, but you can, there are other tools, both free and paid, open source and paid, that you can do this type of thing with. But Ready API is SmartBear's API testing platform. There is an open source version of it called SOAP UI, which you're probably familiar with. And SOAP UI can do similar things that I'm about to talk about here, as in, use the SwaggerHub definition to create your test cases or to create your projects, right? So, this is just happens to be the SwaggerHub integration in Ready API. I've changed my hat now, and now I'm a tester, a QA engineer, and I want to pull in the latest version of this API from SwaggerHub. Ready API is going to pull in that definition. I've got my 3 endpoints here. I can right click, generate some test cases. I know I'm moving through this fairly quickly, but hopefully you get the idea. I'm reusing my OpenAPI file as a tester now. So it's gone from being a design artifact to being a test artifact, right? So I can generate test cases, and I can, just for example, there is an assertion here, and assertions are like checkpoints in Ready API, and one of them is called the Swagger compliance assertion, which asserts that the request and response messages from the actual API are compliant with the Swagger definition. This is a SmartBear example. you can do this with lots of other different tools. It's really just the concept I want to put across today, which is you think about the API design starting in SwaggerHub, but then moving down, moving from left to right across your SDLC. And right here, we're really focusing on getting your testers involved, getting your testers aware of your open API file. And maybe you do that by inviting them into SwaggerHub, getting their eyes on the spec, setting up those integrations with GitHub, and just making them aware that this is available for them as a test artifact. Because I can tell you in my time here, I've had conversations with different teams in the same company, and again, you might have a development team who are invested in SwaggerHub, and then you end up talking to a QA team within the same company, and they're completely unaware of it. They would only love some way to or some kind of blueprint for the API to help them like write tests, create mocks, things like that. So it can happen. You'll notice that the theme in the first two really here is obviously there's technical. There is a technical element to a lot of this, but there is also a theme of communication, right? Using SwaggerHub and using the open API file to facilitate better communication between teams working on the same stuff. So there you go. That is thing number 2, which is invite your testers, get your testers involved with the open API goodness, because there's a lot of cool things you can do with an open API file as a tester. Now, I have to be careful what you wish for now, because I see 13 responses in the chat, so I will have a quick look there and just see if there's anything to bring up with the group. Just scroll back up for a second. Claudio, Jacob, Tom, appreciate all the feedback there. The interest spreading over the whole team for Swagger, including developers, QA, mainframe, DevOps. Yeah, no, that's good to hear, Tom. And then the DevOps team might be interested in maybe not the next thing, but the thing after that that I'm going to talk about. Test analysts receive the exported YAML file, generate code. Very good. Okay, good stuff. So we're getting some good feedback there. Rajesh, form editor is cool. Didn't know I had it before. Great. That's my work here is done. The goal of today's session is, highlight things you might not have been aware of within the tool. Gloria has asked, do you have any suggestions to use SwaggerHub for JMS messages? Unfortunately not. Not to give a blunt answer to that question, but SwaggerHub is not the right tool for that job. So SwaggerHub, and I'll jump back into the tool for a second. SwaggerHub only understands Open API and Async API. So you'll see, when you go to create a new API in SwaggerHub, let's move some stuff around here. You will see that there is a option here called specification. And those are either different flavors of Open API, which is RESTful APIs, or Async API, which would be for event-driven. So we don't really have anything for JMS messages specifically, unless it's an implementation that you could map to Async API as it's event-driven, but no specific JMS support, unfortunately. Now, suppose you could in theory use async to we're gonna do it live. JMS and async. Be a bit of crossover between JMS. Perhaps not. No, I don't think so. I think, Gloria, for that question, probably the best advice I could give is to look into Async API on the off chance that there are some use cases for JMS or JMS support within Async, because there's no JMS specific support within SwaggerHub. But I think Async would be your best bet there. Cool. And we'll jump on and we'll move on down the road to the next thing. And the next thing is to get your APIs in front of the right consumers, or even just in front of the consumers, right? What do I mean by that? A question I always ask in early stage SwaggerHub conversations is, are the APIs that you or your team working on, are they internal or external, right? So are these, kind of are these for services or microservices that, internal dev teams in your organization are going to use between themselves, or are these, APIs that you're going to monetize, are these APIs that you're going to be publishing and making available, on a public portal or something like that to try and get, third party consumers to start using them. And if the answer to the latter is, or if the answer is the latter, then, there's functionality in SwaggerHub to support that. And some of it ties into what I've already talked about. I would definitely say that if we think about thing number one again, which is getting the right stakeholders involved in the design process, depending on the number of stakeholders you have or number of consumers that this API is going to have, then it could make sense to include some of those consumers as, collaborators or reviewers of your API. Now, obviously, that might not scale very well if it's a completely open source public API and you've no way of knowing, the limit of how many consumers the API is going to have. But if you have an idea of the number of consumers, and it's a manageable number, you might invite them as collaborators on the API while it is still in the design phase, because it's going to be very useful to get the feedback of your end consumers before you've written the implementation code for that functionality and realize that it's not what they wanted, or it's not the right format of data or the schema or the path name or something like that. It's always easier to fix these issues when it's still, the API is still just a YAML file, rather than when it's a couple of different C# files or JavaScript or whatever the case might be. So get your API in front of the right consumers. Another way of thinking about that within SwaggerHub is to start thinking about SwaggerHub as documentation tool. So what is SwaggerHub? Depending on the context, it's either mostly a design tool or it's mostly a documentation tool. When I say context, I would say depending on the customer that I ask, like we've got big, customers using SwaggerHub and they just think of it as a documentation tool. They don't really leverage any of the design functionality. Their open API comes from elsewhere. They get that into SwaggerHub and they use it as a way to present documentation. Perfectly valid, but you're missing out on some functionality, the design stuff I've talked about so far. You flip that, and we've got a lot of customers who mostly use SwaggerHub as a design tool, but don't realize that they can use it as a documentation portal, which they can. So the screen that I've had up for the most part here has been the API view. So you're looking at an individual API, and we talked a little bit earlier about our kind of code editor, form editor view here in the middle. But on the right-hand side, you have your Swagger UI preview. So Swagger UI is an open source, is really the open source Swagger tool. It's probably what most people picture in their mind's eye when they hear Swagger. So Swagger UI is a tool that takes a raw open API file as an input and renders it as documentation, right? This view here that we're all familiar with your kind of blues and different colors and your endpoints and paths, things like that. So that's your SwaggerHub documentation. Now, if you're using SwaggerHub, you can present the API as just documentation by clicking on the View Documentation button there. And that will bring you to a URL, which is, as you would expect, just the documentation. And up until, a question that still gets asked and used to get asked a lot, the only difference is now the answer has changed, but a question that always gets asked on SwaggerHub demos, let's say in early stage conversations, is something like, hey, Joe, this looks great. Nice documentation, but can I customize it? Can I add more? And you can, right? You can technically add whatever markdown you want to the description section here of your API. So you could have images, graphs, links, things like that. You could have as much information as you want here in this section. Problem is, if you do it that way, it's kind of taking up space in your open API file. And if you need to include a lot of information, it's not the most scalable solution. So it depends, but you can do that. So you can put markdown here, and I'll share some examples at the end of the session. But what you also have is the SmartBear API, or the SwaggerHub Portal, right? This one just happens to be called the SmartBear API Hub Portal because that's the name of my SwaggerHub organization. So this is a fairly new addition to SwaggerHub. So the kind of, think of it as an add-on or an extension to SwaggerHub. The extension itself or the tool itself is called SwaggerHub Portal. And what it does is it takes your APIs that are in SwaggerHub and gives you a consumer-facing portal that you can configure and customize so that an end user of your API doesn't have to come in through this view, right? As in to log in through SwaggerHub, click on your API, see the code editor view, etc. The idea here is that you have a portal that you can share with your external consumers, and it's more like a shop front for your APIs. So this is why I started this section with the question about are your APIs internal or external? Is typically Portal is very interesting for teams that are using SwaggerHub to design externally facing APIs. So when you click on that button, that SmartBear or that Portal button there in the top right hand corner, you get brought to your let's say your back end or your admin view of your portal. And what Portal does is it adds this idea of a product. So you won't have seen the word product in the traditional SwaggerHub interface. There's nothing called a product. You have your organizations, APIs, domains, etc. But your product is a portal specific thing, and a product is a group of APIs. So one or more APIs that are already in SwaggerHub plus additional pages of documentation. So it's these additional pages that are kind of the big value add of Portal. So you can see in my Portal example here, I've got 3 products. My payees API is a product. And if I go to edit the product content, you'll see that I've got here on the left-hand side, these are my my contents, and your content is either going to be a page, which is just a markdown, additional documentation relating to your API, and then the API or APIs themselves. So you still have that Swagger UI view, your SwaggerHub view of your API, but the additional information here is your pages, right? And this is typically for things like getting started guides or troubleshooting guides, or giving examples of a workflow for a particular API, stuff that is extremely relevant for an API, but not always easy to capture in an open API file. And what that ends up looking like is, so if I go back to my home and we'll go to the Portal live view. So this is what the view looks like to the consumer who's accessing your APIs via Portal. So you've got a different URL, smartbearcoin.portal.swaggerhub.com. You can customize this view here with whatever images, text, these are your products. So it's a more consumer friendly view of the APIs. Terms that we're starting to use a lot more here at SmartBear would be providers and consumers, API providers and API consumers. If you're an API provider, if you're an individual on a team, but you're more provider than consumer, you're probably living in this view of SwaggerHub where you're creating APIs, editing them, designing them, etc. If you're more on the consumer side, then this view is for you, right? This is where you're logging in and finding out how to actually use an API and integrate it into your systems or your workflows. And it's a relatively new addition to SwaggerHub, so you may not have seen it already. If you have a SwaggerHub Enterprise account, then when you click on your organization, you will see an option up here to start a trial for Portal and to kick the tires, see what it looks like with your APIs. So if that's a use case that you have in mind for your team, do let us know. We'd be more than happy to take you through it. But ultimately, you can still add that type of information to the API within SwaggerHub. Without Portal, it's just a question of how much customization for your documentation do you need. So that was thing number 3. Just get your APIs in front of the right consumers. Thing number 4. But actually, I'll bring up thing number 4 on the screen, and then I'm seeing lots of notifications in the chat. So let me have a look in there and see if there's anything I can. Is there a way to generate BDD feature file using Swagger REST API endpoint? No, but we've got something similar for contract tests, which I'll talk about. That's, spoiler alert, but that's thing number 5. So dear, you might be interested in the last thing that I'll be bringing up here. Dharma and Coralie have asked a similar question. Do you need to pay extra for Portal? What is the license option for the Portal? So yeah, unfortunately, bad news out of the way first. It is a paid extension, and it's for enterprise only, Coralie. So you would need to have a SwaggerHub enterprise plan to then use Portal. So that's how it works in terms of plans. Rajesh says he's getting a 404 when clicking on Portal. Not sure why. If that's still happening after the call, Rajesh, I'm not sure who your account manager would be, but maybe give them a shout and we could take a look at that and see why that's not working. So let me have a look at the clock. How am I doing? Okay, maybe 10 or so minutes left. So we'll finish up maybe 10 minutes time. We'll get to the last two. So the last or the second last suggestion for getting the most out of your SwaggerHub usage is to build SwaggerHub into your CI/CD pipelines. How does one do that? I'll tell you now. Sorry, I got distracted by another notification there. I'd keep them coming. We might not get to all the questions live during the session, but rest assured, if you asked a question or posted something in the chat, we'll reach out after the webinar. So do keep the questions coming, and we will get to you eventually. So I do appreciate all that interaction. Build SwaggerHub into your CI/CD pipelines. How does one do that? One does that using the SwaggerHub CLI, and this is something that anecdotally, I would say most teams that I talk to post-sale with SwaggerHub are not aware of the SwaggerHub CLI, or have not either been made aware of it or haven't had a chance to test it out. So the SwaggerHub CLI, as you might expect, is a command line interface for SwaggerHub, and it's pretty easy to set it up. You need Node.js 18 or later in the environment that you're running the CLI in. You can get the CLI from npm, and you need to have a SwaggerHub API key and your SwaggerHub URL. But once you have those 3 things, you can use the CLI to your heart's content. What can the CLI do? It can do quite a lot. And just to give you an example, you can use the CLI to create a new version of an API with a spec file that you attach in the payload. You can use it to retrieve information from SwaggerHub. So if you need to find what's the default version of a particular API, or you want to maybe set a version to the default version, or publishing and unpublishing, like these are 2 that I see and suggest teams use in their workflows a lot, where publishing an API in SwaggerHub, depending on how you've got your workflow set up, it's not the same as publishing an API on your gateway, for example, but you can connect those 2 steps in a pipeline if you want to, which I think it makes a lot of sense, where once an API, an implementation of an API is published on a server somewhere and ready to be used, then it makes sense that you would want to publish the documentation for that same version of that API, and you can do that automatically using the CLI, for example. So the CLI is useful and interesting for automation use cases. A specific use case I wanted to call out is the idea, or the possibility of using the SwaggerHub CLI to run your standardization validations, to validate your SwaggerHub API using the rules that you have created within SwaggerHub. It's kind of two features I'm talking about here. The features are the CLI, but also your custom rules, your standardization rules, because they are the rules that are being used by this validate command here. So take a step back. Those rules that I'm talking about, they are visible and available on your enterprise plan. So if you have SwaggerHub Enterprise, you have access to these rules. And what those rules are is, if I click on my org settings and I jump into my standardization tab here. So the rules are guidelines that you can apply to all of the APIs in a given SwaggerHub organization. And what these are doing are linting your API spec files and checking for certain things. Is, for example, is the OAS spec version in the correct format? Or if you're writing custom rules, which you can do Like I've got some custom rules here that's checking, does the API have a Jira ticket assigned? And it's doing that by looking at the file to see if there is an X-Jira ticket line or field in the spec file. And if there isn't, then that check would fail. So you can be very clever about how you write and implement these rules. So you're ultimately dealing with all of the information and data that's in the Open API file. But if you put the right stuff in the file, you can set up automated validations for things like this. So, the API must have a Jira ticket, or you've got some pre-baked rules here. There must be an API title, API description must be there and not empty. Every SwaggerHub plan will validate that your API is valid according to the Open API spec, right? By that I mean, if you're in the editor view and you write something that is invalid Open API or according to the Open API spec, that'll pop up here in the validator, right? So every plan will do that. If you have enterprise, you can write these custom rules or extended standardization rules to validate the usability and the suitability of your API design for a particular use case. So the Jira ticket thing, according to the Open API spec, officially, not every API design has to have a Jira ticket, but within your team, it might be useful and very important for every API to have a Jira ticket assigned to it. So using your rules and using your CLI to run those rules in a pipeline context, you can automatically check, or you can fail a build, for example, or block a build if your API design does not have a Jira ticket or does not have some value that you've deemed to be important. I'll share an example workflow. I'm pretty sure it's private, but if there's interest, I can certainly clean this up a little bit and share it. But here, for example, we've got it's a GitHub action workflow that is leveraging my Open API, or leveraging the SwaggerHub CLI along with Test Engine, which is another SmartBear tool. It's a functional testing tool that runs ready API tests in the cloud. And this workflow is, if I open this up, what we're doing here is running ready API functional tests that were generated using my Open API file. Then we're installing the Test Engine CLI, and I think I might actually be looking at the wrong workflow here. There's another workflow that pulls in the SwaggerHub CLI as well. So I'll find that one and we can certainly share it after we finish up. But my point is that you can use the SwaggerHub CLI to connect the dots between, functional testing, validating your API using your standardization rules, publishing your API. You can automate SwaggerHub related tasks. A lot of people, and this includes like longtime users of SwaggerHub, naturally think that the only way that you can use SwaggerHub, or the only door into SwaggerHub, is your UI here. It's the main door, but it's not the only door. You also have your SwaggerHub CLI. You do also have your SwaggerHub IDE extension. So if you're using Visual Studio Code or IntelliJ, if you search the kind of extension stores for both those IDEs, you will find SwaggerHub extensions which let you edit and design an API, Open API spec in your IDE, and then push that up to SwaggerHub. So those are two, the CLI and the IDEs are kind of two alternatives for working with SwaggerHub. So I'll do a quick look at the questions because I know we're ever so slightly over time and we've got one left. So we will, you know what I'll do, if that's all right. We'll do the last section here, which is use your SwaggerHub API for contract testing. What I might do while I'm talking about this, and hopefully what I'm talking about will help, will influence some of the responses. We're going to launch a poll about the areas that we talked about in this webinar and which areas are the most interesting to you. And regarding the API contract testing, I'll start describing that now. So if that does end up being interesting, you can certainly reflect that in the poll responses. The last thing here is to start using your SwaggerHub API designs for contract testing. So I could probably speak for an entire further hour about contract testing, which we don't have, and I won't subject you to that after 45 minutes of listening to me. We don't need to listen to me for another hour. But contract testing in a nutshell it's been around for a while. It's not like radically new. It's been around for over 10 years in the form of Pact, which is an open source contract testing tool. And as a concept or as a methodology, it's been around for longer. Like you'll find references to contract testing, tool agnostic, going back further than that. But where SmartBear is concerned, what we do or how we do contract testing is with a framework called Pact and a tool called Pact Flow. And what contract testing is, in a nutshell, let me just pull something up here. I'll explain how this relates to SwaggerHub and OpenAPI in a second. So we're on Pact. We're in Pact world now, which is contract testing, and it's an approach to integration testing for microservices. So if you are, and this line here should probably give you an idea of the problem area that we're working in. So it says, say goodbye to end-to-end testing. And what do we mean by that? So contract testing sits in organizations and architectures where you have microservices, you have API providers, API consumers, and many providers and many consumers ultimately make up your production architecture, and you need to test that architecture and make sure that everything is going to be able to talk to each other effectively and work as the end user expects. But the back end of that is many microservices who need to communicate. So one way of testing this would be to deploy everything at the same time, run your tests through it, and observe the results, which can be time consuming and costly. Another option would be to do contract testing. And what contract testing is you pick an integration. So here you've got microservice A and microservice B, and you establish a contract between those two microservices. And the contract is stored in an application called a broker. And the broker makes that contract file available to the provider, which in this case is microservice B, so that it can validate its functionality against the expectations of the consumer. So if that sounded unfamiliar, which if you're not already familiar with Pact, it probably did, this diagram here breaks it down in a little bit more detail. So you pick two services that need to talk to each other. One of them is the consumer, one of them is the provider. And from a SwaggerHub perspective, think of the SwaggerHub team as the provider team here. So the SwaggerHub team are developing and maintaining an API. That API has a lot of consumers. We need to let our consumers know what our functionality is as providers, and we also need to know, can we as providers meet the expectations of the consumers? So how Pact contract testing solves that problem is that the consumer writes unit tests using Pact. Those unit tests produce a contract. The contract gets stored in a Pact broker, one of which is Pact Flow, that's the commercial broker. And then that application, the broker, makes that file available to the provider for it to validate its behavior against the consumer's expectations. So this version of contract testing is called consumer-driven contract testing because only the consumer produces a contract. There is another option called bidirectional contract testing, and that's where SwaggerHub and OpenAPI comes in. In bidirectional contract testing, both of these teams, consumer and provider, have contracts. The consumer contract is still the Pact file, which is a JSON file of API interactions. The provider file is your SwaggerHub OpenAPI file. And the validation as to whether these two services can work together is done by a comparison between the consumer's Pact file and the provider's OpenAPI file, which is driven from SwaggerHub. And how that looks inside the tool. And Pact Flow is the tool in this case, but this will give you an idea. So this is Pact Flow. Pact Flow is the application that stores the consumer contract and the provider contracts. So if we find, let's find a bidirectional example here. So I'm looking at a provider information here, and rest assured that not a lot of this might not make sense to you if you're not familiar with Pact Flow and contract testing, but I'll make the connection to SwaggerHub here, is that you have a provider contract, which is an OpenAPI file. So you're reusing your OpenAPI file as a provider contract. So it's useful from the consumer's perspective. It's also useful from the perspective of a user working in SwaggerHub. So I'll finish up with this example here. Like I am looking at a particular version of my API in SwaggerHub, and let's say that this, I want to check the compatibility of this version of my API spec with my consumers. So the Pact Flow integration here will check the compatibility of this API spec with any consumers that it has in Pact Flow. Now this will pass because this has been tested already. So I've got a passing integration here, and the compatibility check will tell you it's basically retrieving information from Packflow and saying that this API has X number of consumers and it's compatible with all of them. This is useful to a SwaggerHub API designer because if you create a new version of this API and change an endpoint or change some data model or change anything, and you change something that would break an integration with a consumer, the integration will tell you that. So you have an early warning system as to whether a change to a path or an endpoint would break your API. Like, for example, I should be able to change, if I'm not mistaken, changing the path name here will break or would break so if I was to change payees to payee, my consumers would break. And that's very useful to a design first user because you can find that out while your API is still an open API spec file. You haven't implemented this change yet. You have not broken everything in production or broken everything in the integration environment. Everyone's happy. So you'll forgive me if that was a very speedy introduction to contract testing, if that was your first time encountering it. Rest assured, if you want to hear any more about it, let us know and we can certainly set up a longer call. But the point of the final thing here is that you can take that open API file from SwaggerHub and use it as a contract for a contract test. There's also a new Packflow AI tool which will let you generate consumer tests, contract tests, out of your SwaggerHub open API file. And I think someone asked a question about BDD earlier. The closest thing we have to that is the Packflow AI tool, which will take Swagger file as an input, generate your consumer contract test as an output. And we can share some videos about how that works once we finish up. So we've already run the poll. Thanks to everyone for answering. I would say any questions, but I've been saying that frequently throughout the session, and people have been asking questions, so I do appreciate that. I'll try and get to one or two more. Harry says, the integration command will be helpful. We are hoping to use a script to set up repository integrations during CI/CD when we create a new API project. Is that possible? Yes. So well spotted. There is a CLI operation that will let you set up SwaggerHub integrations automatically. And what you've described, lots of teams do. So they, instead of manually going into SwaggerHub and setting up this and that integration, you have a pipeline that does it for you. You just run that every time. Can we automate with Ready API to verify the spec versus the implementation on a cadence? Sure, Harsha, yes, you sure can. So Ready API has, there's an extension called Test Engine, which I mentioned earlier, that will consume automated Ready API tests or run Ready API tests on a schedule. And those API tests can be based off of your open API file, like we talked about earlier as well. So that is certainly possible. Couple of other questions. Is the standardization section enterprise feature only? It is an enterprise feature. Does SwaggerHub support external linting tools beside the inbuilt standard and custom rules? Yes, we do. So Spectral is a API linting format you're probably familiar with if you're in the API world. SwaggerHub supports that. So you can import Spectral rules into SwaggerHub standardization feature and use those. Very useful because Spectral is very widely used. There's lots of public Spectral libraries available, so you can just take those and import them directly into SwaggerHub. So I'm going to stop there because I know we were only scheduled for 45 minutes, but we had a little bit more to talk about, and I wanted to get through it all. If you asked a question and I didn't have time to get to it, apologies. We will get back to you once we finished up the webinar and once the recording is sent out. We can reach out with anyone who's asked a question, or if you do have an account manager, if you're an existing SmartBear customer, get in touch, let them know, and they can schedule a call with the relevant person. It might be me, it might be one of the team, other members of the team, but we will get to your questions and thoughts on SwaggerHub, Ready API, Packflow, anything at all. With that said, I do appreciate everyone taking the time. I know we're all very busy, and there was quite a few of us on the call here at one point, so thanks for taking the time out of your day to join. I do hope this was useful, especially if you're an existing SwaggerHub user. I hope that there was some nuggets in here that will help you get more value out of the tool. Thanks for taking the time, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their days, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.